Could you please take a seat so that we can open our session? Now, good morning. Let's start. Now without further ado, give the floor to the Regional ADA Coordinator, Mr. Jury, for the presentation. Long-awaited presentation, by the way. You have the floor. Thank you. I'm going to read my yesterday's notes. Well, quite briefly, because of course we have to continue our works with the current agenda. I simply would like to add something about the coordination initiatives of the audit authority. So the meetings we are having to further study certain topics. So simply let's give the floor to the other speakers. There'll be time to go deeper into this matter. Thank you. Sorry, it's frustrating. I mean, there is a proposal on our part. Yesterday, we didn't complete the question and answer session. However, this morning we have two very important presentations. As for the questions, we asked the Commission to please read the questions and possibly reply even in a sort of draft. The idea would be, let's begin with today's presentations. The first one is the Sicilian region. And so if we complete in time, we might accept a few questions. Otherwise, you'll receive the written answers and possibly we can meet here and there to reply. Thank you. Grazie, you have the floor. So now, good morning. I hope my presentation is going to be clear. There are some initial thoughts I'd like to convey to you. No risk analysis can be properly done, if we are not aware of the programs. You have to study the programs, you have to have a specific control experience, and be aware of the history, let's say, of this program. Be aware of the possible errors or corrections in the previous programs, so during the previous controls. This method we prepared with our own managing authority is something created for our own program, for the Sicilian region, a program with its own specific features. I think that we should think about our own program according to what we have at our hands. In our case, I'm speaking of the European Social Fund. We have a 5,800,000,000 euros program. The program provides for 32 different responsibility centers, intermediate bodies. The audience, therefore, is made up of very complex, let's say, actors and so many subsequent actions. So we tried and built with the cooperation of the managing authority. So we tried to to prepare this general framework, a reference method for us, in order to then select the operations to submit to the first level controls as much as possible effective, as much as possible fruitful, able to consequently lower the risk of submitting reimbursement requests with a high level of corrections, as we mentioned yesterday. The other MS, I have to say we need to update all of this periodically, because here we speak of evolutive documents, I mean, based on what's going on during the program. This is a complex program, as I said, high financial level, covering different responsibility centers and so many calls to activate, and above all, there is a big chunk of actions to be deployed in the territories, like 1,800,000,000 euros that are part of this program, fully devoted to such territorial actions. So for the intermediate and with the intermediate bodies, metropolitan areas, aggregations of former provincial authorities or municipalities, all of this simply complicates the program. As for the method, first of all, the normative reference context was the basis for us, especially the European Commission document. We studied the Commission document, and based on this, we processed and prepared our method. The reflection document provided for the ex-ante risk analysis to be done based on the operations and or beneficiaries. We made the decision to apply both options. So we built this method, which is based both on operations. When we speak of operations, we mean the notices and the beneficiaries. The analysis starts very early, first of all by identifying the risk factors. So by operation, by beneficiary. Second step, assigning numerical values according to the set of indicators and risk indicators. The risk level is medium, high, and low. An overall calculation of the overall risk according to each and every action. In the case of FESR, we try to look at the whole picture, the whole, where there are aids, tenders, bids. I mean, the overall calculation is then based on this, summing up all of the points that eventually give you an indication on the overall risk for every action. The last step is the establishment of the sampling quota. And here intervenes the first level control. This is the workflow that enables us to understand, chronologically speaking as well, the sequence of the steps. The method applied to the analysis macro areas, in our case, identified 3 big, as I said, areas. Of course, based on the past. Macro areas are state aids, the procedures regarding the call for tender, so public procurement, and financial instruments. Within each macro areas, we identified several risk factors, like for state aid, we try to differentiate beneficiaries and the operations. In case of the call for tenders, we've identified a method looking for the procedures, meaning whether there are operations, groups of operations of more or less than 5. In case of a control, we are going to check them all. If we have more than 5 operations, we'll always have a sampling. And then another procedure within the same public procurement area more specifically designed for the territories. As for the financial instruments, starting from the idea that all of them will be checked and controlled within each and every instrument, as for the first level controls, we think to check 25 items. We might even increase the number to 30. So, this is in general the situation. I'd like to underline that in our case, we decided to prepare such areas because each and every area has to be equipped with different instruments. In our opinion, we could not carry out a risk analysis on the general program. Rather, we had to take into account the macro areas individually. Now, this is a summary of what I said, the macro areas, and within each and every one of them, the way we intend to proceed. This is the most important part. That is trying to identify risk factors, preparing, as I say, the battery of indicators. This is why we had to cooperate with the audit authority and managing authority, because based on the experience of the audit authority in programming 1420, and here I refer to the work done presented by Anya on the risks, so criticalities. You know, in order to prepare a good method to be applied, the first step, in my opinion, should be to prepare a curve, a graph, see what happened during the program 1420, identify the yearly critical points, understanding the root cause of the issues, and based on this analysis, the idea is to produce a battery of indicators well thought, well considered, because every managing authority has its own battery of indicators. This is our own for the Sicilian region. It is a tailor-made, so to speak, solution. At the same time, we used the indicators in the reflection document. The starting base is the Commission's document, and based on such document, we then made a decision and selected the most appropriate elements for us. So we started from the first cluster, that is the personnel having to manage the program's actions. That's another point that's important before entering into the details. One operation, and I talk to those who are really involved in the operations, what did we do with the managing authority? Well, when the notices were delivered, when the managing authority and the responsibility center already published the notices, and we received the requests, like for the state aids, we received notices that might include even 500, let's say, requests or instances. We didn't open the dossiers because the idea is to simplify the work of the managing authority. So all of these, let's say, factors will build, having in mind a so-called responsibility center who has to work and perform in terms of eligibility of an application or a request. However, it doesn't look into the dossier. It doesn't go and look into the company's legal status, whether it is a shareholding company or limited responsibility. I mean, they are not looking for all of these items, because in this case they would really waste so much time. and the very aim of this method would simply dissipate. This method has been created to create and carry out effective controls on a low number of operations, because in our case, what it happened for the 1420 controls didn't go well for us because they were 100% controls. If you have to check 600, 700,000 operations, it's quite impossible. So what do we do? It is a really fatiguing experience. What happens that the error rate might increase. So this is why I quote the experience of the personnel. One of the factors the managing authority in processing this method should look what kind of staff do I have? Are they newly hired? Are they experienced and qualified? And this is true for both for the instructions, what we call luco, someone who's responsible for the implementation, but also for those who take care of the controls. So, in case of highly qualified people in this UCO, highly experienced control staff, that's okay. Conversely, the risk may be very, very high, and the score could be from 1 to 3. That's another very important factor. Is this action new? What's the level? Of course, in case of implementing a new intervention or a new procedure, the risk might be high. On the contrary, if you have already some experience, like if you already had the control from the audit authority, and such actions simply continue following the prior program, of course the risk is lower, because those who control have already acquired a certain amount of experience, so it'll be easier for them to identify the error. A different matter is when you have to control an operation for the first time. This is another important factor to consider, and so we have prepared also the points here. The third, are they retrospective operations? We, and the Commission knows this very well, if they are, let's say, retrospective operations, in this case, and for this kind of operations, we've included another indicator. I'm speaking of operations selected by the managing authority to attribute them to the program, and this has been going on for over 3 years, so the risk is high. If the time decreases, the risk accordingly decreases, going towards a medium level risk or even a low level risk. Speaking of an operation which didn't cover even a year, from the time the operation was attributed to the program, to even a low risk level, because the so-called native operations are customized with the program, while the other kind of operations, the so-called retrospective, is born with another notice, and it is more or less applied to the program. However, the first vision is different. This is why we speak of high, medium, low risk. The other battery, the other set, refers to another area, the reporting provided by the operation, whether it's real cost reporting or cost simplified reporting. And what I say refers to what we also discussed yesterday. In case of standardized reporting procedures, it is easier to use the system. Our work as audit authority, or rather the next work we'll do with the managing authority, is to convince the responsibility center to use the OSC to improve the reporting, to simplify the procedures. Okay, so these activities should be kind of merged in order to achieve a satisfying result. The higher, the value, the higher the risk. The lower the value, the lower the risk. Results have to be tangible. In case of operations with tangible results, or no. This refers to the previous experience, 1420, on the research activities, research projects, by their own nature, bring to very little tangible outcomes or results. This evanescence of results emerges very easily and leads to a high number of errors, something already confirmed by one of the reports from the Court of Auditors, European Court of Auditors. They identified the lack of tangible outcomes, which implicitly led to a higher number of errors. Localization of operations in case they are implemented within the region in various areas or not, and the term or duration, biannual or even lower than 12 months. And here again, the risk is from high to low. This is the first part, summarizing what I said so far.
Quindi qua invece poi ci sono i range che sono stati stabiliti per questa valutazione del rischio.
And here we have the ranges set for this type of operation. So low risk from 9 to 14, medium risk 15 to 21, and then from 22 to 27.
Invece la seconda valutazione fatta per
And this is the second assessment based on the beneficiary. So we took into account the type of beneficiary. And once again, based on our experience, we have observed that for regional operations, own operations, in case of aid, mistakes are often recorded. Whereas when the region provides subsidies through the municipalities or through the local authorities, then the risk lowers. And in the case of private subjects, it ranges from high risk with investment aids to medium risk if aid is provided for the purpose of working capital. Of course, risks are lower there. Let's say they have more space, more room for maneuver. In case of aid for investments, there are so many factors involved, and there's a higher risk of making mistakes and, let's say, incurring into irregularities. We also considered the main legal form in every action or procedure. We have considered third sector subjects, the composition, whether well, of course, if there are more partners, there's a higher risk. If there are few partners, the risk is medium. With one single beneficiary, the risk is, of course, lower. This is another table. And here we have attributed scores: low risk, medium risk, high risk. Well, of course, the managing authority, once risk assessment has been completed by action, by operation and beneficiary, an overall risk score will be attributed. And according to the various combinations, a final score will be calculated to establish whether the operation is characterized by high, medium, or low risk. And this is another graphical example of the risk combinations. Subsequently, our managing authority has attributed percentages and sampling criteria, and that means that if the operation is characterized by high risk, sampling will amount to 30%, in case of medium risk 20%, in case of low risk 10%. And once this percentage has been set, our managing authority has decided to give priority to the high financial amount and the least, let's say the lowest financial amount operations, and then use random criteria for what is in between. But of course, it's up to the managing authority to make this decision. And here is another interesting aspect. What is the timeline? What is the time frame for this? So we have assumed that the managing authority looks at two types of submissions of refund applications based on the, let's say, regulations and based on the date of December the 31st, which is of course an important date. So we thought of a model looking at these two time windows, since the managing authority should work based on statements of expenditure which are submitted at least a couple of months before submitting the actual refund application, so that we have time to perform all our controls. So the requests are submitted. Once the expenditure has been made and the authorization is requested to the managing authority, sampling is performed and the first level controls should be closed before submitting the refund request. Otherwise, there would be an overlapping. If you submit the refund application without closing the first level controls, there would be, I repeat, an overlapping, and so it would be difficult to detect errors, the type of errors. So this work would be, as it were, stultified. And it's a little bit of a challenge, since we know very well that especially when we move closer to December the 31st, and the managing authorities are under pressure because they have to reach their expenditure targets, so they do submit expenditure statements, and they tend, to move closer and closer to December the 31st. There's this trend, and it's a sort of bottleneck. That's why the work should be planned piecemeal, over time, gradually, so that the model can truly be effective. How will these irregularities be processed then? If the managing authority detects irregularities, there's no error projection in this case, but there's the control extension to see whether that error is a punctual error. It's a systems error or systemic error. If it's a systemic error, then control must be extended to all the same type of operations, so as to make sure that it doesn't appear in the other operations too. For example, the size of companies. So size and also connections. Many companies, when they submit their statements, maybe they don't really understand the regulations, and so they tend to provide wrong or incorrect data. They tend to say that they are, let's say, individual companies, that they're not connected to other companies, but then we discover the opposite when we perform our controls. So in this case, should irregularities of this kind be detected, then the audit should be further extended. This is the update of risk assessment, which is very important and should be carried out at least once a year, so that it can encompass what happened in the previous year. It can take account of the detected irregularities, and an update is possible to make the model more and more dynamic and effective. At our managing authority, we've realized that this model can be effective only with an efficient electronic system. To make first level controls easier, the electronic system, through its filters and so on and so forth, should help us structure the work, and especially when we're dealing with actions with many beneficiaries, if we can categorize all these operations, and we can do that at the eligibility stage. The applications are received, they are split into categories, and through the filters, information can be macro aggregated, as it were, and based on that lead to an effective risk assessment. So the electronic system, in the case of risk assessment based on sampling, plays an even more important role than compared to past programming periods where they were, let's say, filing systems. In this case, they're not supposed to be filing systems only. They should truly enable the work of managing authorities. These systems should enable a clustering of operations and increase efficiency. So I said significantly, I have written here, significantly reduce administrative burdens also for intermediate bodies. One last consideration or question by the managing authority. Following on what we said yesterday, following on net corrections, following on the whole system, as I said before, the managing authority can hardly complete its controls before submitting refund applications. That's not the rule. First level controls must be completed by the time the accounts are submitted and the feasibility package. So there is a risk of overlapping. According to the Commission, I mean, if the managing authority has not completed the controls and then the audit authority detects errors and there's an overlapping, they're sampling the same operations and actions, then maybe the first level verification gives a certain result, the second level audit a different result. And as we said yesterday, what's going to happen in the case of net corrections? If the error has been detected but not processed yet, I mean, the error has not been dealt with, we don't know whether the correction will follow or not, because controls are not completed. There are issues, but no correction has been dictated yet. And then, of course, there is the issue of net corrections. Now, we hope to be able to implement this model the way I've described it, but I realize that there are inherent risks to the amount of operations and to the magnitude of financial resources which might lead to correction measures that will be assessed at a later stage. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Grazia, che ha mantenuto la sua promessa.
Thank you very much. Very, very clear. Very clear. I was, even me, you know, I was able to follow you. Thank you.
Very well. Congratulations, Grazia. Congratulations, very, very good and thorough presentation. I think a very good practice and model. Maybe on my side, of course, on one or the other aspects, my colleagues may have a question. For example, when you presented the percentages of sampling, we were wondering between ourselves why only 30% for high risks, while on low risk you still go for 10%, which could be maybe rebalanced, but this is your judgment. At the same time, you said also that, of course, if you find any problem in the high risk, you go further. So this is a first indication and validation of the risk level. And if you confirm the risk level, then you enlarge and you go into all, I would say, the spectrum or the scope of the problem. So that's quite a good approach. Well, one question on my side was you use the noi, the nous, we did this, we did that, but you are audit authority, so you work with the managing authority. What was the share of the initiative of the audit authority and the share of the managing authority? Were they willing in the managing authority to do such a risk analysis, or were you the initiator? Did you push for it? And you said rightfully that the experience of the auditors is very good, and Anya's excellent presentation of yesterday was also the basis for this type of risk analysis. When you see where errors occurred per type of beneficiary of action over years and so on and so forth. So what was their appetite for this risk analysis? And finally, your point on the IT system is absolutely crucial. If you have a wonderful analysis, but at the end of the day, you need to do a human-based analysis of all the calls, it would be a huge, huge work. So you absolutely need this IT system. How did you develop this how did they develop this IT system? Were you helped through technical assistance? And maybe the audience has more questions, of course, for Grazia.
Allora, per quanto riguarda
As far as the first question is concerned, it was the managing authority who took the initiative. So they submitted a first work, a preliminary work that had been, let's say, worked out by, let's say, another body in the region, but we reviewed it. We did it because after a few years of experience, I truly think that it is the audit authority that in the end knows the programs best, especially in the regions with many centers of responsibility, because centers of responsibilities have sectoral views. Each of them knows their own sector, but who is the one with a 360 degrees view? We always stratified aid, tenders, instruments. So it's the audit authority that gains an overview because it has to see all the notices, all the commission documents, all the detected risks. And in the end, so we can say that it's only the audit authority that benefits from this overview. So in our opinion, that preliminary work looked at the program as if risk assessment could be based on the program, but that's not the case. It has to be based on historical data, on what happened. So all of that has to be taken into account. So they submitted their preliminary work, we processed it, we reviewed it, we rediscussed it with them. They submitted a second version, and then we shared it in the final editing. So it was joint work. And we'll submit that work to the responsibility centers. That will be the next steps. We'll present it to the departments which actually implement the expenditure. I mean, it has to be explained, otherwise it's top down and they don't know what to do. Coming to the IT system, yes, we did address to the managing authority which developed the software used by the region of Sicily. We summoned a meeting with the managing authority and with the software company so as to implement an upgrade of the IT system, an evolution with the following aim. And the aim is to evolve the system to such an extent so that when data are entered in the period of 21-27, to enter the data through the reports and make the work easier for the responsibility center. So it's a company selected by the managing authority. Yes, if I may, before listening to the other questions. Yes, I have, let's say, 5 questions here. I didn't exactly understand at what stage this risk analysis takes place. When the operation is selected, so I didn't quite grasp that. And as regards the weights attributed to the scores, they are one close to the other. It's one for a low-risk operation, only 3 to a zero-risk operation. So I didn't see, let's say, in my opinion, the required gap. And then I couldn't see the difference between administrative differences and also the place. A fourth aspect is the experience of the beneficiary who's been managing European funds for 5 to 10 years without any issues. That was not considered as a risk factor. And then you said that public tenders with less than 5 operations or 5 operations will be selected. I didn't understand whether that was referring to contracts. Maybe. Yes, you're right. Maybe I wasn't very clear there. The model is applied differently whether we're talking about aids or tenders. Let's call them that way. There are so many types of aid. In the 14-20 period, we had axis number 1 for research, starting with 6 lines of action. Every line of action could entail hundreds of applications. Axis 3 was even worse. We had a myriad of actions with hundreds of applications. What about tenders? That's different. In the case of axis number 10, school buildings, well, of course, there were many operations to be implemented because beneficiaries were all municipalities of the Sicily. And of course, in each municipality, there were different schools. It might have been the renovation of different schools with hundreds, dozens or hundreds of beneficiaries. So that's why these 2 blocks are different. When is it that risk assessment is carried out with respect to aid? When the department, the responsibility center, has published the notice and applications are coming, that is the time when risk assessment is performed. But it can be performed even without any applications because it's already based on the tender notice. You know how it is structured and to whom it is addressed. Certain, for example, research projects will entail different partners, or for the de minimis, you only have one subject. Or de minimis projects with a low value, and instead research projects entailing an expenditure of 40 million euros. So there's enough data to carry out a risk assessment there. But in the case of investment aid or aid, the assessment should not be based on the company. You waste too much time. You're not effective. For tenders, instead, we analyzed what type of calls or bids had been, launched. Trains, for example, maybe just one operation. Well, in that case, you control 1 operation or 2 or 3 operations. But in that case, risk assessment is based on the operation. So we open the operation and we carry out, let's call it sub-sampling. We don't check everything. We'll just focus on some aspects. So this is what we wanted. We wanted to develop a model encompassing the different needs and requirements, and of course it has to be adapted to the different cases. Field, you're talking about place, so field verifications, they will not apply in 2025. There will not be any field controls, not even in 2026, I think. However, when updating the methodology, yes, I knew that field verifications were missing, and they will be the subject of the first update of the methodology. And as far as the beneficiary's experience is concerned, so you said what was unclear? Yeah, the experience in managing, I don't know, research projects with no irregularities. Yes, of course, we'll consider that if the subject has proven its ability to manage ESI funds. And also in the operation you sampled, the research operation you sampled, the 115, well, we saw the difference between how the same thing was actually dealt with. For example, it was required to indicate in the timesheet whether the work was performed at a given step of the research or development project. So the timesheet was okay. So many hours of research, so many hours of development, and then it was easy to give the actual number of hours for the public sector. For the private sector, that did not apply. That wasn't there. So, but coming to experience, of course, universities are well trained with community projects. They know how to fill in a timesheet. They know how to submit documents and reports. If a private subject has never done it, in most cases they make mistakes. So you give them a form, and you ask them to give a self-certification. Sometimes they don't know even about the type of company and whether it's associated to other companies or not. And sometimes you don't know whether they are in ill faith, that they knew that they were declaring something untrue, or whether they simply didn't know the regulations and their self-certification was wrong. Of course, experience plays a very important role. And as regards the attribution of scores, well, in my opinion, yes, it's up to the managing authority, but in the end, the high-risk operations should be sampled more, should have a higher sampling percentage. Then 30%, 40%, it can be adjusted. If we see that 30% is not enough and doesn't filter enough errors, of course we'll change it. It's part of, it's dynamic.
Ok, diciamo, ci sono domande?
I see one question from the floor. I was just thinking, I don't remember the rules about risk-based management anyway. When a managing authority has to prepare a risk analysis, the universe for sampling, what is this? Not necessarily operations, it could also be expenses. So you can select expenses rather than operations. Or, let me make an example, a tender. a tender. Most of the risk lies in the procedure. Not the individual SAL, you know, the work progress status, but the procedure represents a level of risk. So after analyzing the tender procedure, you don't have to necessarily check any subsequent SAL. You can select a sample, right? So is this a parameter to assess risk? Because if we shift attention to the expense, the reluctance by some managing authorities may be overcome, because what do they fear? They are afraid of possible net corrections. Zero risk doesn't exist, yes, but one criteria, one parameter could be the individual expense instead of the operation. So the population could consist of expenses and not operations. Am I clear in my question? Mauro, you can sample requests for payment, operations, and more. There is a former member state that considered risk a bit differently. The managing authority received payment requests. Every request had a code and a color, yellow, green, orange, or red, and the color depended was related with the risk level and the sample. So in this way, beneficiaries send payment requests. First level controls should have a system in place that checks and decides whether controls are needed or not, as you do, you know, when you go through a metal detector at the airport. You try to detect risk before something happens. Sampling, subsampling, these methodologies can be employed at pleasure. I mean, it very much depends on the series, on the program's type of expense. You can have a small program with 100 operations and a program with thousands of operations. There you may need a subsampling. You have to focus on quality control instead of performing 900 quick controls, and when you go fast, quality may suffer. May I? Okay, please. First of all, my congratulations, because I see that Grazia has worked hard to adjust, you know, the managing authority proposal. I have some doubts. I'm thinking aloud, how can I apply this to ERDF in Campania? And I think it is difficult. My fear is that, as you have seen yesterday, 50% of our projects showed irregularities. Hence, how can I put this? So much work for nothing. I mean, I'm afraid that at least, you know, initially, this hard work by many people, quantifying, you know, individual notices, and also, even, down to the level of beneficiaries, and maybe at the end, you control 95 rather than 100% in regions or programs that are large, extensive, difficult. I'm afraid that the final result is simply to reduce the number of projects, of small projects, and every year after, finding errors, you have to work again to change the risk level. Something that was considered a medium risk has gone into your sample, and now it's a high risk. I'm afraid that the number of controls increases all the time. This is my doubt. It takes a remarkable effort in terms of human resources in different periods of the year, during the year, but for what result? This analysis, by the way, has to be completed within specific deadlines. Notices and the like begin at different times during the year. I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud. Okay, let's say in theory control is 100% according to the model. With this methodology, you have 100 operations, you control 30 of them, you find 1 or 2 errors. Even if you expand your sample, you don't have to control the other 70 operations. For instance, an error has to do with the size. You will only check the size in the other operations. So it takes less work, less effort. But what is the alternative? What other options do we have? The model submitted by the managing authority was a bit different because it involved operations, type of operations, but then in the end I noticed, I remembered one operation that was quite heavy for me. It was about tourism, and according to the first model by the managing authority, that type was low risk. And I said to myself, we suffer the damage worth over 15 million euros. Is this low risk? What do I mean by this? In our specific case, we decided for all actions of the program to check, to control them. There is no action where not even one operation is controlled. All of them are to be controlled to a greater or a lesser extent. And if you find one error, you will simply check that error. So after all, it's not so difficult. What other model can we follow? 100% doesn't exist. 100% means taking a checklist, put it there, and that's it. This is our experience. Can I put a question on the impact of this new approach for the audit authority? These methodologies are to be updated from time to time. We don't know exactly when, because this depends on the outcome of management verifications. So managing authorities shall be engaged in the continuous update of this analysis, and they have to decide whether sampling upstream or downstream as you realize what projects are to be controlled. So my question has to do with our role, especially now during the startup phase. Many authorities declare the expense for the first time, for this accounting year. So as time goes by, when we perform system audits, we will verify the actual application of this methodology. And I'm just asking, what are your expectations from audit authorities? Shall we put in place an ongoing monitoring concerning these analysis and risk analysis methodologies? I mean, managing authorities, I put myself in their shoes. They are trying to understand how to move around. Nobody knows whether these models, these methodologies can be performed properly. So I'd like to better understand what is the role of audit authorities, especially with respect to system audits and the proper application of such methodology. Shall we accept the method selected by each individual managing authority, for instance?
I think we had already some ample discussions about this, but maybe you did not participate to all discussions. But the methodology should be ex ante. It should be established in advance, as explained now, and when you start receiving the managing authority receives the operations and the selection is done, then you can apply your risk factors to the operations and they decide how far to verify these operations. As Grazia explained, the involvement of the audit authority is absolutely welcome. It's foreseen in the regulation, it's a responsibility of the managing authority, but because of your experience of the previous period, your involvement is absolutely crucial. And we understood from the presentation that this has helped the managing authority to refine the approach, to understand the approach. And we also remember very well the case of tourism in Sicilia. But it's a bit like the financing not linked to cost of the SEOs. We had a huge debate in the audit community saying, do we have to be involved as auditors, knowing that afterwards it will be part of our system audits? And then we need to have our independent views. We shouldn't be bound by whatever prior agreement we would have given to the system. I think that we have overcome this fear. We've seen that the involvement of the audit authorities in SEUs, FNLCs, in risk assessment is quite useful and crucial to be preventive. But this being said, when you do your system audit, we do expect that you review the implementation of this methodology. Did the managing authority do an exercise to put it in a drawer and then they continue to do business as usual, the 100%? As Grazia said, passa, because I don't have time, I just put my signature on the checklist because I have so much, I can't really reflect anymore. So the idea is really that you do system audits. During your system audits, it's part of the key requirement on management verifications. You see whether they apply a methodology. If they have no methodology, you raise that as a finding. You encourage them to reflect. And in that regard, I wanted also to react to what Anya said. You said it all already. If in Campania ERDF you consider that because of the high risk, 100% is still valid, you go for 100%. So we are not going to make financial corrections because the managing authority does 100% verifications. Of course not. We are not going to interrupt the program. We are not going to put them in category 3. But it's really an incentive in the regulation to tell the managing authorities, look, so far you've done 100%. We gave you, as Brian said, possibilities for sampling, for varying the level of intensity of checks. And still, the error rate is above materiality. So still, you are missing, you managing authority, first level control, you are missing so many errors. So what is the problem? And we saw that one of the problems is of the problems is also that the managing authorities are overwhelmed. At the start of the period, they can do their checks because there are few operations, but when the program comes to a maturity, there are so many projects they cannot do their checks properly. Therefore, any modern administration should reflect about this risk analysis. Where do I have to put my resources? Is it reasonable to continue reviewing salaries of public officials when this is zero risk, compared to, I don't know what, time spent by some private employees on some research operations or whatever. This is not a theoretical example. I remember as an auditor seeing a managing authority reviewing the salaries of public officials. And I was saying, you are losing your time. Is it really your risk? Is it your problem? So you are right also, Mauro, that you should also maybe introduce this dimension of the type of expenditure. Within one operation, you have some expenditure which is more risky than others. Depends on your experience. Sometimes there is a very good practice and habit of time allocation to operations. Maybe in other cases there is not. And this is the risk, because there you know that the beneficiary is systematically wrongly defined, the time spent on operations. So it's really your job as audit authorities to be first preventive and to help, to provide advice, to help the managing authority to set the right methodology. Then you will, as part of your system audit key R4, verify that they have a methodology and that they implement it. And third, I would say you are part of the feedback mechanism. Grazia finalized the presentation on the need to update this methodology. There is no time frame for this, but you need to introduce the feedback from the management verifications which were carried out and from the audits, because your audits will be an opportunity to show to the managing authority that either their risk assessment did not allow them to check some operations, but you still find problems there, which means that their risk assessment is not as strong as it should have been. Or on the contrary, they checked some operations, you audited these operations, and you still find problems. So there you will help them again to be aware that they have a problem. So you are part of the feedback mechanism, you are part of this update of the methodology, and you should make recommendations in that regard. So in conclusion, I really think that since yesterday, we've seen that communication with the managing authority, intermediate body is crucial really to improve the system. We're having different roles, but we have to communicate because we are working on the same reality. We have to work together, and particularly with these risk-based management verifications, we need to provide this feedback, we need to alert them, make recommendations, and we are not only there to do our audit report, have an error rate, and then we go to the next accounting year. We have really to work together. This is absolutely crucial. Communication is key, and it reminds me very much of the Charter on Good Communication that we adopted in the community in 2018, where we said that we should have a charter to communicate regularly with the managing authorities. And this exercise is precisely about that. We communicate preventively and ex post when we have our results to help them improve constantly the issue. But I agree with all of you, and Grazia demonstrated it. It requires additional work. It requires IT systems. It requires to adapt our methodology. But I think the status quo is not an option. No? When we see the error rate and when we see how this policy is being criticized for being too much subject to error rates, I think it is not an option. We still have a lot of billions to be implemented till the end of this period, so we have really to deliver.
Abbiamo solo un'ora di ritardo, quindi direi passiamo al punto successivo.
We are an hour late, so I think we can move on to the next item. The floor to Cristina. Cristina will discuss conflict of interest. Very briefly, I would like to illustrate our experience in this field. Last year, we organized a training on this. If you really have knowledge of programs, if you are truly familiar with programs and the risk analysis, we know zero risk doesn't exist, but evaluations are needed. It takes a cultural leap forward, and this is what we did with the managing authorities, and they were reluctant. And evaluations were the same, like we too had problems. According to the managing authority, DUL was zero risk, or new intermediate bodies. They were considered zero risk, but they had no experience. So it takes dialogue and debate with them. You should guide them, and this is all but easy. But this is what we did. We provided them with sheets and alerts, but you know, at the end they improved. This is not a best practice or anything, but I call it an organizational effort. We have to deepen this analysis. I try to put together two topics, conflict of interest, verifications, and fraud prevention through the use of Arachne and other tools, because I think that this is a single process. Information collected during the verification is used also later for the analysis of fraud prevention. So our goal is to get an overall picture, trying to guide audit activities towards areas at risk. Most importantly, officials doing the on-site inspections should collect information ex ante to then focus their work on the right topics, to focus on specific information to ensure more efficacy of those audits. The procedure that we have defined consists of two levels. First, control on the staff of the audit authority. We have defined the procedure to collect and store declarations about conflict of interest, but also oversight and verifications through corrective procedures in the event these problems are identified. The second level consists of external, outside subjects involved in projects, intermediate bodies or beneficiaries. Have they adopted codes of conduct, self-declarations? This is to ensure the independence and fair judgment, fair opinion of their work, in their work. After collecting information, the subsequent stage begins. And this is important to perform an analysis of the fraud risk.
Che adesso vi andremo a descrivere.
So we have a tool that we invented somehow that gathers specific information on the sampled project, type of project, beneficiaries, involved subjects. We use Arachne and also other databases, PIAF, RNA, Coesus and others. Coesio and others, because we want to focus on areas at risk to effectively direct audit work. This preliminary analytical work, as it were, then goes into a report, the so-called preliminary analysis by Arachne, containing outcomes on conflicts of interest for outside subjects involved in projects, any signs, any red flag for the fraud or irregularity risk, and financial anomalies like double funding or inconsistency concerning the personnel cost. This is the idea to provide you with an overview of our work. Now, Simona, this is teamwork. We met several times. We had to turn this into actual initiatives and actions inside our organization. And what was important to me was to maximize the efficacy of this analytical and preliminary work and allow inspectors, before they go out, to get a complete picture. Again, we wanted to train them to work on the basis of risk factors, trying to focus their requests for documents, papers, type of sampled operations in a targeted manner. Simona, please.
Good morning. Very well. As you heard from Ms. Colombo, basically we have experimented an organizational model for auditing conflict of interests. We've adopted two procedures. One related to the staff, the auditor of the audit authority, and the other one related to the specific functions of the audit authority. So it's a very simple tool, a collaborative tool. And we'll show you the extensive use of Arachne and of other databases for our preliminary analyses. So the aim is to provide each auditor for a database for the analysis of the conflict of interest and fraud contrast, so as to carry out a more in-depth analysis. Let's start with a short description and then we'll go into greater depth. Everything starts with the sampling. Officers and consultants are entrusted with the audits. So they fill in this collaborative form with all the data, and they release a statement which says absence of conflict of interest. And in turn, it becomes the object of the sampling to carry out sample checks of the statements of absence of conflict of interest. At this point, so we have a team in charge of preliminary surveys that reviews all the statements of absence of conflict of interest, whether they are proprietary regional operations or whether they are entrusted to different actors. Once these statements have been reviewed, based on the data in the collaboration tool, we'll collect all the data related to the beneficiary or to the sampled projects to check for double funding, etc. All this flows into a report which is then validated by the audit authority and is delivered to each auditor. This applies to every single sampled operation. Let's go into greater details. As regards auditing the conflict of interest, we have two procedures. One is related to the staff and the other one to all the operations and the functions. The procedure related to the staff applies to the officers and consultants entrusted with second-level controls and follows the assignment of operations. What do we do then? Well, we collect and then verify, review the statements of absence of conflict of interest, and then we file them in the project folder. Risk assessment and sampling. Here are the risk indicators. Exposure to the risk of conflict of interest or likelihood that the risk generates or may damage the public interest, and then impact on public benefit if the risk is actually found to be there. Impact, it means how serious the damage or the impact is. And then we have the specific functions of the audit authority. Regional, I mean the region's own operations, and here we'll check the various subjects, actors of the managing authority, the assessment teams, whereas for the other operations, in addition to them, we will also check public, or rather conflict of interest with RUP and the members of the audit, or rather the members of the bid commission. So we actually audit everyone. So what do we do here? Well, first, we verify the presence of a code of conduct by the audit authority, the managing authority, the intermediate bodies, and the beneficiaries. Then, of course, we verify the presence of a disclosure for beneficiaries on the absence of a conflict of interest. We verify the presence of a statement of absence of conflict of interest of all the subjects of the managing authority involved in the management, including the members of the assessment commission in the first level controls, and all those who have functional tasks. And then we will, of course, verify the actual operations and the statements through Arachne and the other databases. So we will verify possible links and connections between either the beneficiary or the managing authority, the intermediate bodies and the managing authority, and so on and so forth. This is the collaborative tool I was mentioning. It's an Excel file asking each auditor to enter the operation and fill in the data about the project, the expenditure certified as a positive expenditure, the operation code, the COOP code, the auditor, the priority, the delivery expiry date, because of course we need to set our own priorities in processing these reports. We will enter data related to the beneficiary. I mean, they are supposed to enter the data, and the time span to the verification of double funding. Then we'll ask the auditor to enter the subjects, so managing authority, beneficiary, etc. Finally, we ask for the priority to carry out this or that analysis, the control date, so as to come to a finalization of the report. So we start from the sampling, the assignment to officers, data filling. Then we verify the statements of the absence of conflict of interest for the various subjects in the various operations. And then through Arachne, we are also going to check for the occurrence of operations under the same name. And of course, we also audit double funding. So we analyze the situation of each project and each beneficiary on Arachne Web. And we also check the other databases whenever there are holes in information. It's information we cannot find in Arachne, and we get into Telemaco or PIAF, the database of Regione Lombardia, the Coesio database, although it's a little bit problematic. So we try to match the data to see whether they're actually matching or if further data are needed. We also use PA for outsourced operations to see whether members of the project commission may have had roles in the public bodies managing the funds. And then we use VIS to check for the presence of beneficiaries. Data are collected and a report issued. The report will include data related to sampled beneficiaries, sampled projects, verification or audit on the absence of a conflict of interest. Let me skip this. As regards the sampled beneficiaries, we will rely on the financial statement data, the presence of Italian or foreign subsidiaries belonging to Italian or foreign groups, industrial groups, and then the risk profiles, reputational risk, and fraud alert. And then we focus on the sampled projects. So we identify risk profiles related to tenders, contract management, eligibility, concentration, performance, and reasonable criteria. And then we also check the so-called cumulo, so the piling up. So the double funding, so we suggest the auditor to check for the presence of the COOP code, which applies to one and only expenditure receipt. If there are any staff receipts or vouchers, it gets a little bit more complicated because we verify the actual period of time when the activities were carried out to see whether there were overlappings between projects, maybe similar projects, and then ask for further data like timesheets, etc. So we're going to supply the auditor with a sort of program, a sort of list of similar projects, showing them the time overlapping of the former, so as to, let's say, give a direction to control. So we collect correlated projects taken from Arachne and compared with PIA. We select projects of the same, let's say, belonging to the same time period. We check for similarities, and then we, let's say, carry out a field analysis. Thank you.
Very thorough presentation. Do you have time to do anything else than checking conflict of interest? Because it seems very thorough. Thank you very much. One question after all of this. Did you see with this approach some tangible results which you think you didn't have before you had this very thorough approach? First question. And second question, what is your experience with these IT systems, databases, in particular the use of Arachne? Do you see some useful results coming out of this?
Allora, sicuramente è un
Well, undoubtedly, it's a very extensive work. It works. We find this approach works, and in some cases we had to go into greater depth. We followed the whole procedure, the personal data. Well, this is immediately connected to so this, let's say, correlates with the IT instruments. I think Arachne has a very big issue. It's impossible to identify a connection in a a tried and tested way. So when we analyze a beneficiary, we look for connections of the top management roles. So we start from the top management roles of the beneficiary, and then for each role we also check those reporting to them, the second level. So these people play a top management role, but in Arachne I don't have a single identification that I can correlate with the Italian identification system, which is our fiscal code. In Arachne we have an identification code, but no fiscal code, no tax code. Simona Frustaci is my name. I was born in the 27th of in 68. There may be other 10 people, you know, with the same data. Let's say the true identification code is the tax code, the fiscal code. So through Arachne, even if I find a correlation, I will never be certain about the presence of a conflict of interest. It will remain a suspicion. I think we should tackle that issue. It's so important. Cohesion is still at an experimental stage, still insufficient. Sometimes I cannot find projects, I cannot find beneficiaries, or I find beneficiaries who should be, lead partners, but they're identified as partners. But it's a very important tool, potentially very important. Yes, indeed. I think this is such an important work because we can, let's say, appreciate the potential which is not yet, let's say, exploited by the existing instruments. It is certainly very useful. An auditor cannot just carry out its activity blindly. He or she should rely on a thorough picture and should be aware of when asking for further data in a kind of gray area. So that's very useful. Undoubtedly, the risk of wasting too long a time in advance at the preliminary stages because information is lacking, well, that forces them to carry out cross-verifications, cross-examinations, even cases of homonymy. No, we had several cases of homonymy. We don't have access to the single personal data archive when, with your credentials, you can verify. No, we have to address to the individual municipalities. Maybe you're lucky, you have a small municipality, and the officer is very kind and quick, but especially in large cities, they don't even answer you. So what do we do? Do we leave that, let's say, audit open forever? Well, no doubt. So we have to make the effort of putting together the various units of the puzzle. How useful it can be. Of course, it's still work in progress. We're still working at it. And existing instruments, existing tools, I think everybody will agree, have further potential, and not all of them can be utilized thoroughly and, yes, to exploit it to the most. But at least we have a procedure so that everyone knows who does what. And is directed to the risk areas.
question of the single identifier is a key issue. We are very well aware, and we try to work on this for the future, in particular by using also artificial intelligence in the system. And in the Arachne Plus system, the corporate system we are developing, will have the use of artificial intelligence, and we try to see how to link individual beneficiaries to their fiscal codes, indeed, to be sure, or to their VAT codes or whatever, to be sure that we have one single identifier. Cohesio is indeed still at the experimental stage, I would say. Cohesio is an accumulation of all the data published by the member states, so we are very much in the hands of the managing authorities. And in Italy in particular, we found many problems of publication of information. So if you find data in Cohesio which is not right, please report back to your authorities. You will help the system to improve, because we see in Italy that indeed publications are not necessarily at the level of the beneficiary. There are really different types and levels, and Cohesio is a tool for information.
Fare una domanda, un chiarimento, ne approfitto poi. Alle volte parlando insomma con la...
Sometimes declarations on the absence of conflicts of interest. Many managing authorities claim that sometimes officials or subjects involved with the management perform repetitive activities, like, you know, questions that come in all the time. So every time, every day, should you make a declaration on the absence of conflicts of interest? It's a bit too heavy. So in spite, you know, even if you don't have so many declarations, do you think that one declaration attesting to the absence of conflicts of interest is sufficient? You may, for instance, sign a declaration at the beginning of every year, declaring that in the event a conflict arises during the year, this shall be declared. And indeed, there is no item to sample for verification purposes in this case, but you can always perform a control, even if you don't have an explicit declaration. You sample the procedure, you verify that some officials are in charge of controls. So even if there is no explicit declaration, you can always verify whether or not there was a potential conflict for those people. I'm just asking for a confirmation. Do you think that a declaration like this is allowed?
Sì, certo, Mauro, l'obiettivo...
Yes, Mauro, the idea is to have one declaration on the conflict of interest if the procedure is clear. I mean, automatically, those who don't have made any declaration, you can automatically imply that there is no conflict of interest. I mean, when you sample an operation, you sign off, you sign, you declare whether or not you have a conflict after looking at the detailed documentation upstream. You don't know whether or not you have an affinity with the award of a tender, for instance. Transparency is what matters. In case there is a conflict, it must be declared. And then it will be the managing authority to decide. Paolo? Pasquale from Calabria, always on the conflict of interest.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti. È doverosa una premessa.
Good morning, everyone. It is the first year I participate in the annual meeting. I didn't participate last year. I was appointed only a few months ago, so I participated in the October meeting in October, and I learned about the dialogue and the constructive dialogue between the authorities and also the colleagues of IGRU and the Commission. It's an atmosphere of collaboration that I can perceive here too. Talking about the development of the digital platform for the management of statements for the region. Well, the Commission carried out a specific audit on the conflict of interest in the past. It involved the managing authority, the audit authority, some beneficiaries, and a local visit. And it was based on that audit, on the potential criticalities emerged, that the calibration of new tools started with the aim of making audits on the provided statements to make them more effective. So it was the opportunity to turn a criticality into an opportunity. Of course, we owe it to the precious work of the Commission, of IGRU, not only with respect to the problem analysis, but also with respect to the adopted solutions. So we have developed a methodology to manage the audits, to adopt measures against the conflict of interest, and all of that flew into the review of the manual of the previous programming period and the new audit manual of the 21-27 period. In parallel, we thought of the opportunities offered by digitalization, and we submitted a specific model. It was submitted by the region of Calabria in Aosta last year, and it was well received also by the Commission. So there's a substantial continuity between the recent past, both in terms of updating the procedures and in terms of shifting from the model you already know to the description of the first development stages. I am first going to submit an update. Cristina presented the model for the region of Lombardy. I will confine myself to update you on the new measures adopted to meet the requests of IGRU and of the Commission. We talked about risk this morning, and of course there was the risk of, let's say, having a little time to speak, and so I have a video, and then if there is time, I will also illustrate the project of the platform, because following on my previous experience, a good project is always the premise to the implementation stage. A good implementation, because it limits the uncertainties related to execution. And of course, there are always uncertainties, even when the project is well designed. I will share with you the development, the platform development stages, various activities, some of them sequential, some of them in parallel, to digitalize as thoroughly as possible all the conflict of interest audits, and finally the time frame. The goal is to ensure compliance with national and European regulations on conflict of interest, so as to not to undermine the fairness in implementing public operations, and then the mission. I'm going to focus on the corrective measures that we adopt in-house, so about the statements delivered by the General Director and the officers in charge with audits and controls. So the general manager, designated as audit authority, delivers a declaration of incompatibility and absence of interest. And in case of potential conflict of interest with respect to sampled operations, then the procedure of Code 4 of the Ethical Conduct is triggered. There is a duty of abstentions, and the decisions by the management team will be taken by a body presided over by the General Secretary and made of the general managers of the various departments. So the committee, instead of the audit authority, appoints another managing director who is requested to deliver a statement of absence of interest in that operation. The General Secretary entrusts a peer with the task. So a transparent measure is to publish the decision of the management committee together with the statement, to publish it in the portal of Regione Calabria. So it's a public, let's say, communication measure. What about officers of the auditors when being entrusted with a specific project are required to issue the same statement? And so there will be a sheet showing the auditor the type of statement, whether absence of conflict of interest or potential conflict, the type of verifications carried out to check veracity, and then the adopted measure in case of non-veracity of the accounts. The audits are carried out by a commission set up in 2024 in Sector 1 of the Audit Authority. It is entrusted to regularly check the veracity of statements with of course, in the various institutions, with the support of RACNE. Based on our experience, we have adopted a code of conduct of the staff, the auditing staff of Regione Calabria, and sent it to the authority entrusted with we call it prevention of corruption and transparency of the region of Calabria, based on the code of discipline of regarding conflict of interest. This code of disciplinary code, in addition to envisaging specific measures, entails dedicated forms to highlight some of the statements that the officers should make explicit, both based on the analysis of previous statements, which is a regulatory and legal analysis showing that some of the relevant aspects in assessing conflict of interest must be explicitly, let's say, presented, submitted when submitting the statement. We have decided to summon a conference entitled Conflict of Interest, Control Ethics, Conflict of Interest between Prevention and Countermeasures, so as to come to a sharing and update. And of course, we like all the following authorities to participate, the Commissioner, GRU, etc., so as to come to a joint document to support irregularities. Let me show you a short video.
Digitalizzazione significa trasparenza. La Regione Calabria, di concerto con l'IGRUE del Ministero dell'Economia e la Commissione europea, ha avviato un percorso ambizioso per la creazione di una piattaforma digitale per la verifica delle dichiarazioni sul conflitto di interessi. Lo strumento ha l'obiettivo di velocizzare le attività, dematerializzando la documentazione e standardizzando i processi, e semplificare la compilazione delle dichiarazioni e la verifica delle informazioni. Una piattaforma unica che centralizzerà i processi, favorirà le verifiche preventive e renderà efficiente il flusso di lavoro. Uno strumento integrato e interoperabile che semplificherà la valutazione delle informazioni, archiviandole in modo sicuro, e terrà traccia dell'evoluzione di dati e documenti. Già nel corrente anno verrà avviata una prima ricognizione della fattibilità di istituire collegamenti in interoperabilità della piattaforma con banche dati esterne in collaborazione con i GRUE. Il tutto combinato con l'intelligenza artificiale, che darà un supporto attivo al verificatore attraverso la pre-analisi di un grande numero di informazioni e l'utilizzo di alert per segnalare eventuali criticità. Un sistema che permetterà di monitorare le dichiarazioni con cruscotti personalizzati e di verificare lo stato delle dichiarazioni rese, controllate, validate e non conformi. La Regione Calabria si è resa promotrice e capofila di questa iniziativa a livello nazionale, per progettare e poi implementare la piattaforma a livello regionale e consentirne il riuso successivo in altre regioni. Un percorso in 2 fasi. La prima prevede assessment, scouting tecnologico, disegno dell'architettura e del modello di interoperabilità e rilascio prototipale della piattaforma entro il 2025 con le funzionalità principali per l'autorità di audit. La seconda fase prevede il completamento piattaforma, l'estensione per l'autorità di gestione e gli altri dipartimenti, l'implementazione dell'intelligenza artificiale e conduzione operativa. In entrambe le fasi del processo sono previsti formazione e change management. I vantaggi offerti dalla piattaforma saranno significativi, in quanto permetteranno di aumentare l'efficienza operativa dei funzionari grazie alla digitalizzazione dei processi, automatizzare e standardizzare le procedure, riducendo errori e tempi di gestione, verificare le informazioni attraverso dati certificati e interoperabili, garantendo maggiore affidabilità. Utilizzare l'intelligenza artificiale per supportare la lettura e l'analisi delle informazioni. Verificare il 100% delle dichiarazioni compilate, assicurando precisione e trasparenza. Un passo importante verso innovazione ed efficienza nella gestione delle dichiarazioni sull'assenza di conflitto di interessi. Un processo tangibile, con ricadute significative in presidio e legittimità delle procedure.
Allora, questa è la sintesi, il promo, diciamo. Adesso, se volete, scendiamo nel dettaglio invece del progetto e poi delle fasi di sviluppo del cronoprogramma. Cerco di scorrere velocemente, poi ci saranno le slide a disposizione per gli approfondimenti. Quindi il confronto tra la situazione di oggi e come sarà.
No, dai, non mi
So,
questa difficoltà.
declarations are generally paper-based now, and this is not in line with, the digital era we all live in. Tomorrow, in the future, soon, through the platform, we will have a centralized management of activities, improving transparency and efficiency, and safety, security, because this is sensitive data requiring specific processing methods in line with national and European rules. So, what requirements the platform should have? First, you have to preventively check the declaration. Sometimes controls are made long after the actual beginning of activities. Now, if you detect a potential or actual conflict of interest, you have to act promptly. What corrective measures to apply? This is why acting preventively is important. We should put in place mitigation measures. Responsible use of AI, and the real step forward will come as soon as we integrate, we get integration and interoperability with databases to retrieve data for controls. As Mauro explained, many times the same subject has to release several declarations for the same assignment. The platform will allow to avoid, these duplications. The management of paperwork will become more efficient. Information will be managed in an optimum manner, and also processes will be managed better, cutting, shortening the time it takes now. It is very important to restrict, the time of verification to a minimum in an effort to achieve efficiency. So, process automation then, of course, implies faster procedures for verification. These are some of the main features of the platform. Management of declaration. It will be possible to fill out the declaration in a guided and simplified manner. The digital signature will be employed, and as I said, we will have a historical record for each declaration. As for controls, the platform will enable to generate sampling minutes according to specifications. There will be a preventive verification system As to other aspects, you can always retrieve through pop-ups the reference legislation. Alerts. Declaration status notices will be sent to subjects. Outcome reports, and you can always delegate control activities. Archiving will allow the upload of documentation and the download as well. This is a mapping of the current situation. A demo has been developed defining the design model. Main developments for the future. We have identified models for declaring the absence of conflicts of interest in the different areas. We analyzed the declaration to map out its contents. The idea is to standardize declarations, creating as little templates as possible. Also, we analyzed the verification and fill-out flows. In Calabria, we have identified 15 different flows. The goal of the platform, after analyzing the filling out and control mechanisms, is to have a univocal definition of a flow to trace the state of a file at any time during the process. Identification of roles and subjects involved in the filling out and verification process. Identified subjects will be grouped into 4 macro profiles: administrator, manager of declarations, compiler, and verifier. Preventive verification of information. To date, what is the limit? As Lombardi pointed out, a first limitation is to shorten, to restrict the activities. Verifications are sample-based, but a request of data for comparison sometimes requires to send email messages or certified email messages through the platform. Thanks to the platform, every time it is possible to ensure interoperability among databases, and this is a huge effort, this will no longer be needed. You can perform near real-time controls to identify any inconsistencies when filling out the declaration or prior to verifications. Interoperability of databases is a key point. These are the databases that we have found. Some are already used by our offices, others may be used. We still have to assess whether their data are helpful for us. Databases, we have to check whether databases can connect to the platform. A quick word about AI. Control activities imply the acquisition and validation of a large amount of information. Information is not always well structured. Structured models, for instance, are tables. AI solutions allow to process contents with different features to support control and validation procedures. It will be possible to adopt AI and AI generative systems to increase efficiency and correlate data of a different nature, both to generate contents and also analyze images, like in this example. We have identified some areas where AI can be applied. For instance, a chatbot supporting the activity of verifiers, or the possibility to generate data request models whenever you cannot employ you cannot exploit the interoperability of databases. We have 9 development phases. Assessment of processes and definition of macro requirements of the platform, technology assessment, and assessment of application assets, those that already exist, that are already available. Technology scouting, the need for an infrastructure. The platform will be hosted in a regional data center, and we need to assess compatibility and integration. Architecture design. Very important is defining the interoperability model versus EU databases. The first implementation and review phase, followed by the full development of the platform, equipped with the AI module. Training, of course, will be key at all levels. We shall organize specific sessions and employ support material with exercises to make sure that all participants do learn how to use the platform. Such a training effort, of course, entails a different change management, because the outcome of control activities will be considered in order to counter frauds. My final 2 slides. This is the implementation of procedures status. You can see the different dates. In May last year, during the AOSTA meeting, we presented the digital management model. In February this year, Calabria submitted the operational strategy to develop the platform. In March, the Ministry of the Economy shared the requirement plan and confirmed the possibility to use POC and other resources to expand audit activities in order to pay for financial expenses. Calabria will host this platform on the regional data center. Last April, a contract was signed within the framework of a framework agreement with Intellera and Accenture. And during the early days of May, we had the kickoff of activities. This is the timeline. Assessment and technology scouting is ongoing. By November this year, we will test the first release of the platform, organizing training courses for our officials. In June next year, the second test, the second and final test of the platform. Let's say the final version, and then technical training of employees and specialist support. In February 27, the platform shall be usable by all regional departments, and the AI module will be released. From that moment onwards, as soon as the platform is deemed and validated as a suitable tool for Calabria, we can jointly discuss how to reuse it in other regions. Thank you.
Grazie Pasquale, come ci hai anche rappresentato stiamo seguendo.
Thank you, Pasquale. We are closely following the development of this IT tool. It's never easy for us to develop IT projects. And now I think we can avoid questions on this, because I think we should end by noon. We have now a communication from the Commission, followed by, a final session to answer 2 or 3 questions that were left unanswered from yesterday. So we are now cutting Frank's speech.
Next point before I congratulate Pasquale and the team in Calabria for this platform. Brian insisted to present it to the whole DAC in Brussels. We had your little film presenting all the steps, very useful. And I really, your very last words was my question. We need to use this type of instrument and give it to all regions, because there is no need to duplicate and do too many of these tools. So congratulations on the presentation. Indeed, we do a short presentation on the control of these vulnerable groups, and then we go. No.
Per il punto sui le posizioni.
As for the disadvantaged positions, next week, during the meeting of the Audit Community Forum, that will be presented. We invite you to please attend, because we want to repeat what our colleagues will be saying next week with Frank's presence. Now, we have 4 questions possibly before closing. They will introduce the question as well as the reply. Could you please display a slide on the questions? Financial instruments. Give the floor to Eleonora. Thank you very much, Brian. Very quickly, I'd like to focus on the absence of regulatory forecasts on some aspects. 3 questions. The minimum threshold to recover the unduly paid amounts, whether the member state is obliged to recover this amount, and what's the point of view of the Commission. As we know, according to the regulation, there's no discipline or something which provides information on how to recover such amounts. The Commission doesn't foresee and possibly expose further or additional orientations or guidance on this. I remind the audit authorities that you have to take into account the irregularities at the level of the total calculation of the rate, and you have to calculate them to protect the community budget. It is upon the discretion of the member state. However, the regularities have to be taken into due account. The second point, it was a clarification on controls aimed at verifying the financial mechanisms and resources of beneficiaries and verifying the operating and financial capability of the beneficiary as per Article 73 of the regulation. It is up to the member state to take upon itself the responsibility to carry out further verifications in this sense. And it is important that according to Article 73, the managing authority must verify upon selecting the operation the financial capability of the beneficiary so as to guarantee the sustainability of the investments, hence the operation over the whole cycle of the operation with regard to infrastructure investments and product investments. They must be financially stable and sustainable during the implementation and also in the following part, and that of the management. The important thing is to select control checkpoints so that beneficiaries are confirmed in terms of the solvability or their financial capability. And this is important for the staff in terms of instruments, and then during the following phases, the monitoring of the project, everything has to be aligned with the whole life cycle of the project. The last question, very quickly, the income generating projects or revenue. Beneficiaries and authorities should calculate the gap in terms of financing and deduct this amount from admissible expenses. In this case, the regulation doesn't provide any provision in the specific matter with regard to these projects, income-generating projects. No specific method is required to calculate the financing deficit. However, we remind you that the member states should in any case comply with national provisions and above all in terms of state aid to guarantee that the operation which might generate a net revenue is complying with Article 73 previously mentioned. It is up to the managing authority to verify that the beneficiary has the financial resources available to cover and hedge all the necessary costs necessary for the deployment, maintenance, and development of the action. It is important to remind you that upon selecting the operation, the best ratio is guaranteed between the support amount and the objective of the undertaking. Next question, double financing. We mentioned this this morning. Thank you, Paolo. Regional audit authorities, national authorities ask us to provide good practices example when having to check double financing between cohesion funds and PNRR. The European Commission clearly provided a specific checklist with some checkpoints which gather together and take into account good practices or best practices identified in the various member states, also following our conformity or thematic audits. The checklist we shared, we can still share it, has got to be tailor-made or customized according to the national instruments that the member state has available. We mentioned open COOP, open cohesion, the financial transparency system of the EU, which contains data information on projects that are directly managed, because the double financing, it's a huge risk. But as Frank said yesterday, the objective, the general aim is to implement the cohesion policies. If there are opportunities, the creation of synergies between financing European sources that are different, of course, the managing authorities will push towards that direction. The general approach is that the same spending shouldn't finance twice from European funds. Another risk, just to refer to another point mentioned yesterday and today on simplified costs. When there's a combination between simplified costs and real or actual costs, there you have the roots of a possibility of a double financing. You have to analyze thoroughly this method and underlying costs, which define the center cost, and avoid that any possible different costs are covered or hedged by real costs from cohesion funds or other funds. That's a reasonable approach. We can, I think we continue. As for net corrections, I think we already discussed this point yesterday. You get our answers, written answers, by the way. We'll send it to you. Number 7, first point, carryover, let's say, of operations from the previous to the new program. Are there any specific guidelines from the Commission on DG procedures in order to align legal relations with the new operations that are phased? Are there differences in terms of provisions, and what are verifications ADA should carry out on the correct implementation of such procedures? There are no specific guidelines on how and what kind of methods the authority should adopt for the selection of these operations. We remind you that in the final report, the Annex 1 should provide the list of operations that are phased. There's a difference between Article 118 and 118 bis in the regulation, which provides information on these two types of operation that should be phased. Maybe modifications to the documents could be necessary that have to be signed with the beneficiaries, or even a change or modification in the program if and when the second phase operation couldn't match couldn't match one of the activities of the program 21-27. So this spending would become eligible from the date of approval. Now, what's the role of the audit authority? Well, first of all, to validate the list of operations subject to this staggered approach. Make sure the managing authority has got its own selection method in these managing activities. Check, verify that the operation is part of the new program, and check all the punctual items defined by Article 118, 118 bis. Criticality, in our opinion, is the financial definition of both phases. One should avoid the risk that in the second phase there are expenses related to the first phase. These are the main risks. We'll provide you also another set of answers to the most frequently asked questions we had from other authorities, from other member states, so you can have an exhaustive kind of vision. One last question. Never harm or never cause a remarkable harm to an individual operation. In case you don't have this situation, well, the Commission published the guidelines and the technical principles or guidelines that were issued for this device, especially because in terms of resilience and recovery, and item 2, a more simplified modality for this type of operations. This verification is not upon type by type, but on type of interventions. It's quite different. These guiding principles were written for this resilience device, but these measures can be found in the type of interventions. In practical terms, if this operation enters into a set of operations so that were assessed as complying with the principle of do not do significant harm, DNSH, they are compliant. Could be the case of operations typically funded by the social fund. They, by their own nature, they rarely have a foreseeable impact upon the 6 environmental prerequisites or requirements. The checklist, which has been presented in the orientations for the closure, has to be focused on type of operations. If you have 6 operations in your sample with the same measure, under the same hat in terms of type of intervention, just make the verification once and then report it in your working documents. I think we have covered all of these aspects, and then if there are follow-up questions later. Thank you. Now, it is 12. Now, I think we should thank Marisa. We'll give the floor to Marisa for the final, let's say, indications. The organization was really perfect, with the exception of yesterday's night. It was our own fault. We were too late, possibly. We didn't want to go home, you know. That's why we thank the region, Ada, Marisa, for the hospitality, translators. Maybe I'll ask Frank to thank the translators, the interpreters. So I would like to thank you all. I thank you for your participation. I hope you like this. I thank Frank Seber and the other colleagues and all the members of the Court of Auditors, and above all, IGRUE. Special thanks to all those I'm involved, Carmen Mollica, Paolo Fischetti, Mauro Calogiuri. Special thanks to Sara Barbieri. She was my mentor. She was very, very useful, and I kind of stalked her. And if I may, I would like to thank the officials in my own structures, Ada Liguria. We worked very intensely for this organization, and the agency in Liguria, and all the other agencies that supported us, technicians and so on. Everything was really smooth. Thank you, and see you in a possible new occasion. Thank you.
Noi proseguiamo col 55.
To thank you very much for all the work here, for the excellent meeting. We see that these technical meetings are extremely interesting. I would like to thank all people who spoke, because your interventions were extremely useful. Maybe for next session, Paolo, we need to reduce the time of presentations so that we have enough time for more dialogue, more discussion, more debate. And these presentations will be made available so that we can have all the details, but maybe we could focus the presentation on a few key thematics so that we can discuss this. But congratulations on the excellent presentations. I remind you that these 2 days showed that your interaction with the managing authorities, IBs, are crucial to solve issues even preventively or when problems occur. So let's continue to do this great job with the managing authorities. I remind you also that for closure, we expect you to be very detailed in your assurance packages, in your last assurance packages, to explain all the different points that we have discussed here in this yesterday in particular. Otherwise, we will have to ask you further questions. It will delay simply the closure. So we expect for very detailed closure reports. For the rest, we'll meet in Rome with all of you in early December for the coordination meeting where we'll continue these great discussions. Many thanks also to my team, because I know that this is a lot of work by my colleagues in the DAC, Christina, Brian, everyone. Thank you very much for contributing to all this work. And it was very nice seeing you all. Thank you.